Israel has told Hamas they have 3 weeks to release all of the Israeli hostages remaining in Gaza, or they'll face a ground invasion in Rafah. Meanwhile, the Labour leader Keir Starmer has called for what he says is an immediate ceasefire that lasts in Gaza. This ahead of a motion to be tabled in the House of Commons by the SNP on Wednesday, calling for an immediate ceasefire, which could see a split in the Labour ranks. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is Conservative MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Bob Seely. Good afternoon to you, Bob.
Good afternoon, Julie.
First of all, let's just talk about this, or basically, the threat from the Israeli government. This is a senior member of the government basically saying, look, we are going to go into Rafah. They've gone through from Gaza City, going south. Civilians have been pushed further and further south. We've seen the bombing by the Israeli Defense Forces of areas, refugee camps and the like, where people have been told to go for safe haven. Lots of concern that if they do go into Rafah, that we are going to see even worse deaths of civilians than the horrible scale we've already seen. But they're saying, look, Hamas release the hostages and then it won't happen. No one thinks Hamas is going to release those hostages. So what will the West do? What should the British government do? What should the American government do in the event there is this mass bombing of Rafah?
OK, I think firstly, we have to recognise two things. Firstly, I know I'm stating the obvious, but let's just do this. What Hamas did back in October was despicable and unacceptable. That it's a vile organisation, and Israel has, under all international law, the right to defend itself under military necessity. However, that does not excuse the level of civilian casualties that we are seeing. And to say that civilians are responsible for Hamas, whether they are sympathetic or not, and Hamas was not a particularly popular organisation in Gaza, and it held control in part through its thuggish violence. We have to recognise that there are two wrongs here as well, and that there are thousands of people, whether they're innocent Israelis or innocent Palestinians, who are caught up in this. So I think what the Israelis are doing is beginning to increasingly look morally highly questionable because of the amount of civilian casualties. And in international humanitarian law, as I'm sure you know, you need to practice the principle of proportionality. Yep. And if you are not practicing the principle of proportionality, and it's a difficult thing to prove because you have to know what the target was and how important the target was. But if you're not practicing proportionality, then you're also in trouble in international law, apart from the fact that you're losing in the court of public opinion, because innocent people are dying.
Absolutely. And again, nobody right-thinking person wants a single innocent Palestinian to die, certainly not children. I mean, that has been the big concern, the high death toll. We're told by the Hamas-controlled health ministry, but we're told these figures are fairly reliable. The question is about proportionality, because there seems to be this idea that, well, if it was 1,200 people who died, Palestinian innocents, that would equal the number who died under the Hamas attack. But that's not how it works. The reality is that actually, in terms of the numbers of civilians who are dying, in terms of the sort of fighting, when it comes to wars that have been waged by Britain, America, other European nations, this is not a disproportionate number of deaths. As horrific and awful and terrible every single one of those deaths is. The question is, are these people being put at risk by the IDF, or are they being put at risk by Hamas? Hamas could, all the people saying the IDF needs to stop fighting, Hamas could today release all the hostages, give up their weapons, and then it would all be over.
Julia, you're absolutely right, but that doesn't excuse Israel's role. No, by the way, I don't buy the argument that Israel is an occupying power, because actually Gaza runs it. Israel has some elements of being an occupying power because it controls airspace and borders, but it doesn't control internally. And actually, it pulled out a number of years ago, as you well know, back to, I think, 2005, 2006, something around there. But Israel still has a responsibility, regardless of the irresponsibility of Hamas. Hamas's use of humans as human shields, wanting to see its own civilians killed in order to curry favour in the court of public opinion, does not negate Israel's responsibility as well. You're asking me what I would do. I think the power of the outside world, and that includes the United States, is pretty limited. If I was the British Foreign Secretary, what I would be doing, I would be working with other Arab nations to get in place as robust the police plan as possible, and to try to push that forward with every effort that I can. I would also be looking in terms of balance at what is happening in the West Bank, and especially with settler violence, which is illegal and immoral and aimed at Palestinians. So if we're going to play with an even bat here, we have to do so. The problem is, Julia, one final point very briefly. Too many people in this country have internalized this dispute. They don't see it as foreign affairs. It's a part of their identity. So either you think Palestinians are victims and that absorbs everything that Hamas or the PLO will do, or you think that Israel are victims and that therefore somehow makes it okay for Israel to mount up civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip. And both of those arguments are badly flawed. But because people have internalized this argument or this belief as part of their political belief system in this country, that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, I agree with you on all of that, Bob Seeley. Can I just ask you, though, about what's been going on? The SNP are going to table a motion in the House of Commons calling for there to be an immediate ceasefire. We've seen Sir Keir Starmer, who's talked about, they need a ceasefire that, can last over the long term. Labour, in fact, the Labour leadership and the Conservative leadership have been very much on the same grounds on this. But Sir Keir Starmer has called for an end in the fighting in Gaza now. We're told this is a bit of a change in stance. There's a big debate about whether or not there'll be any support for the SNP motion on Wednesday, or whether there'll be Labour rebels, perhaps even some Tory rebels on this. Does any of this matter? I mean, I wonder whether the Hamas leaders or indeed the Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, are sitting there going, God, I wonder what the SNP and some backbench Labour MPs think about this issue. How significant is this?
I think what we do, sadly, in Parliament is not very relevant. I don't even think what the Congress does in the US is that relevant, because Israel's going to do what Israel wants to do, and Hamas will do what Hamas wants to do, which is the problem. When it comes to this ceasefire, sorry, it's Keir Starmer being all over the place yet again. I haven't got a clue what that man believes in. I don't think anyone else has done either. He completely misses the point. It's not about whether you have a ceasefire or not. It's about proportionality and about disarming, destroying Hamas with a morally defensible level of civilian casualties. Okay. So this sort of, does Israel have the right to do what it wants, or Israel doesn't have the right to do what it wants? And shall we have a ceasefire? And let's not have a ceasefire because this week Keir Starmer's being pro-Israeli, next week he'll be pro-Palestinian, the week after God knows what. He misses the point completely. This is about proportionality in the rules of war. And unfortunately, despite the fact that he's put on a military jacket, it doesn't make him much of a soldier, and it doesn't make him seemingly much of a thinker as well. So I do think the Labour Party needs to think a little bit more clearly about this. This is not about internal battles. It's not about the Rochdale by-election. It's about how you do the right thing. And the right thing here is to understand that Hamas is a repugnant organisation that should be destroyed, but at the same time, Israel has to practice proportionality.
Okay, you said
and
that.
The evidence very initially suggested it doesn't.
Bob Seeley, one final question, very briefly, if you would. We're over time. We've got obviously the reports of the death of Alexei Navalny, the chief opposition leader in Russia's death in basically a Siberian gulag. And his wife, Yulia Navalny, has said today he was murdered, he was killed by Vladimir Putin. Yet to see the body, the mother is trying to go to the morgue. What should the UK reaction be? What should the Western reaction be to this? What action can we take? Briefly, if you would.
Okay, very briefly. Magnitsky sanctions, that's what they're designed for. The most important thing now is that we can't stop Putin killing in Russia, but we can stop him killing in Ukraine. So we need to arm Ukraine. And finally, we need to look after and really prioritize Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's a British citizen, who is now the most high-profile political prisoner in Russia, and he will be dead soon as well, unless we get him out somehow.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you joining us. That's Bob Seeley. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Conservative MP. Charlie Rowley, leaving Navalny aside, in terms of the convulsions that the Labour are going through in terms of what their policy is on Israel, a lot of and Gaza, a lot of this is all just about those internal issues, and particularly with left-wing and particularly Muslim MPs looking at their own populations.
Yes, and you've seen on the streets of London sort of week after week protests take place where those divisions are spilled out onto the streets of London, where you've seen hate speech on the streets of London, which the police need to do a lot more, I think, to be more interventionist in the clampdown. We have, in this country, which is sometimes what you don't get in the Middle East, is a nation that you can be free speaking, but not at the expense of other communities, not at the expense of hate or preaching war. And so we do need a tough approach in this country. But a permanent ceasefire is effectively an end of the conflict, which is what everybody wants to see, and for all of the reasons that Bob said.
We'd like to see that, but a permanent ceasefire doesn't last long term if Hamas are still in control. That's, I mean,
exactly.
Makes a perfect sense to be that argument.